Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Trey Hester, Digital Director for War on the Rocks. In this episode of Horns, Wen-Cheng Nui, Assistant Professor of History at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, argues that British neo-colonial strategies and anti-communist nationalism in Southeast Asia intersected with pre-existing local antipathy towards China to prompt a shift in the region from European-dominated colonialism to U.S. hegemony. This talk took place at the University of Texas at Austin and was sponsored by the Clements Center.
So let me begin by saying greetings from the warm tropics. It's cool to be here, or should I say it's kind of cold to be here. My presentation is entitled Empire of Dominoes. And as an aside, I'm giving this title a second life because it's one of the titles that I suggested to the press, and it was, of course, roundly rejected. And so I just give it a chance, all right? Let me tell you a bit about what it argues. It argues that British neo-colonial strategies and anti-communist nationalism across Southeast Asia intersected with pre-existing local antipathy toward China, as well as the Chinese diaspora. These things all together ushered the region, Southeast Asia, from formal European-dominated colonialism to US hegemony. Now, why is it called the Empire of Dominoes? Well, of course, you know, in the early Cold War, US leaders tended to imagine the states of Southeast Asia as a row of teetering dominoes. All of them were in danger of internal subversion or perhaps falling under the sway of the Chinese communists. Major studies of US policy in the region, however, focus on one domino in particular, Vietnam. And through America's ill-fated intervention in Vietnam, historians tend to generalize. What do they find? What do they say? US failure in Vietnam becomes emblematic of a broader failure in the region. In post-colonial Southeast Asia, what you see, because of Vietnam as a representation, a general collapse of Western imperialism in the face of indigenous nationalism. And so that's why these are the familiar pictures that capture parts of that dominant story of US foreign relations with Southeast Asia. It's the fall of Saigon. It's an artificial state that was a client of America, that was abandoned finally by a fleeing, humiliated superpower. The North Vietnamese tank is literally gate-crashing a party. South Vietnamese desperate to flee atop the CIA office. US personnel are pushing helicopters off ships to make sure that they have more space for evacuees that are coming on other choppers. This domino came crashing down in April 1975. It was preceded by Cambodia, and it was followed by Laos. That is the familiar story. But what about the broader region? What about the other dominoes and their stories? What about Britain, which won its Cold War battle in Malaya and maintained its military installations in Singapore and Malaya about 2 decades longer than the French were in Indochina? Indeed, what about all those dominoes that people tend to consign to the margins of US foreign relations history and the global Cold War? You know, not least Malaya and the country that I come from, Singapore. Don't we lose, and this is crucial, don't we lose the fundamental logic of interconnectedness in the domino theory if we confine our attention to just the disasters in Indochina? These were some of the simple questions at the heart of my research. And so let's go back to that very start in 1954 when President Dwight Eisenhower proposed the falling domino principle. He would propose this falling domino principle to describe the interconnectedness of Southeast Asia. The famous phrasing is, you have a row of dominoes set up. If you knock over the first, very quickly the last will go over. This is going to be a profound disintegration. Now, 1954, when he coins this, is famous, obviously, to many readers because that's when the French will meet terrific defeat at the hands of the Viet Minh in Dien Bien Phu. And at the beginning of that year, with that disaster sort of almost looming on the horizon, Eisenhower and his advisors met. They knew that the French were already surrounded. They knew that the Viet Minh would strike. There was pressure on Eisenhower to commit American combat troops to rescue the French and rescue the campaign against the communist-led Viet Minh. The record does say that he was not going to commit US combat troops to Indochina. Instead, he said, on the record, with great force, that he could not imagine committing American troops anywhere in Southeast Asia except Malaya. Malaya, of all places. Well, that's because at the time, Britain and its local allies in Malaya waged a war against the guerrilla fighters of the mostly ethnic Chinese Malayan Communist Party. So we'll call them the MCP, all right? London called this the Malayan emergency. It applied this emergency to Singapore as well. Eisenhower saw it as part of a much broader regional crisis. His inaugural speech in 1953 connected the French War in Indochina to the British struggle in Malaya and Singapore and the American commitment to the Korean conflict. And like the Viet Minh, the MCP had also been a popular backbone of a guerrilla anti-Japanese movement during World War II. And it was fairly popular because in Malaya, the peninsula specifically, it was almost 40% ethnic Chinese. The American officials obviously worried about what kind of purchase, what kind of popularity the MCP would have in Malaya, and were also worried about Singapore as well, which was 78% ethnic Chinese at the time. The Singapore affiliate of the MCP had infiltrated Chinese language middle schools as well as trade unions. It was thriving in the island. So from Washington's eyes, the situation in Malaya actually improved suddenly from the 1950s, mid-1950s. British and Malayan forces gained ground against the MCP, and it sent its tattered remains to the Thai border. Britain also shrewdly aligned itself with anti-communist nationalists in Malaya, which the Americans observed with some admiration. That's why in 1957, Malaya got its merdeka, and merdeka is a Malay word or an Indonesian word for freedom or independence. Right? Malaya gained its independence from Britain, and it was headed by a fervently anti-communist Malay prince, the Tunku Abdul Rahman. You can see him here raising his hand at the ceremony. Right? Helpfully, he won his leadership via the ballot box, and he was popularly regarded as the father of Malaya. Also, the Tunku remained very friendly to Britain while at the same time reaching out to the United States. Now, if you're familiar with the Malaysian flag, you'll know that it resembles Old Glory of the United States. It's called Stripes of Glory for the Malaysians, right? And if you've been reading a little bit about this as well, you'll know that several Americans very recently called the police on their Malaysian neighbors here in the United States because they were celebrating their Malaysian Independence Day with their flag, and the police were called in on the defacing of the American flag because people didn't know what was going on. But in any case, within hours of independence in 1957, the Tunku made a broadcast to America, stating that Malaya would tie up its fate with the democratic world. And in 1958, Malaya made good on this by rendering assistance to Britain's intelligence services as well as the CIA in a plot to topple the left-leaning regime of Sukarno in Indonesia. Which is why when these two guys met in 1960, they were elated to meet each other, right? Eisenhower called the Tunku one of America's staunchest friends, a staunch defender of freedom, a partner that the US valued highly in the Cold War. And in private, what he said was that the Tunku should pursue his plans to create a regional organization, an anti-communist grouping that would be clearly an indigenous initiative, not something that would be sullied by too much US involvement like the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. By the next year, the Tunku managed to form precisely such a grouping with pro-US Thailand as well as the Philippines, and it was a grouping known as ASA, the Association of Southeast Asia. This grouping would be the foundation of what today we know as ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that was created in 1967. That would include Singapore as well as Indonesia. Its founding members, the founding members of ASEAN, the founding members of ASA before that, were the conservative anti-communist elites. They fully supported American intervention in Vietnam during the 1960s and 1970s, and they sought increasingly intimate ties with the ascendant superpower. These were the foundational movements of what I see as a wider pro-US trajectory of Southeast Asia, one that would ensconce the majority of the region's resources and peoples in the American orbit at the height of the Vietnam War. We would lose the story of the wider region if we focus tightly on the fate of Indochina. America's failure in Vietnam is certainly important, but without being central. Indeed, without being a determinant of the more consequential developments in Southeast Asia in the period after World War II. Whereas a number of scholars judge that America's humiliating defeat in Vietnam is the end of, quote, a short-lived American empire, my book, forthcoming, considers the dominoes that did not fall. And it suggests that this is an empire of former dominoes, transformed into sturdy stanchions for US predominance in the region. This informal empire congeries of clients, created a geostrategic arc that enclosed the entire South China Sea. It contained the Vietnamese Revolution, and it encircled China. And that's why my book, in its final iteration, is titled The Arc of Containment. And indeed, it reflects what US officials actually aspired to all along at the end of the Pacific War and at the outset of the Cold War. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, architect of NATO, saw Southeast Asia within a great crescent that connected Japan to India. Kennedy administration officials believed the creation of Malaysia, right, the peninsula, as well as Singapore and the Borneo territories, would complete a wide anti-communist arc that went around the South China Sea. The Johnson administration saw ASEAN in, quote, a great arc of Asia and Pacific nations. Nixon fantasized about that long belt of US allies around the rim of China, stretching from Japan to India. What was the base of this empire of dominoes? What was the connecting tissue for British neocolonialism in Malaya and Singapore to mesh with anti-communist nationalism across the region and US Cold War objectives for Southeast Asia? Well, I suggest that it's this, the Chinese problem. When you look into the dominoes that surround Indochina, you find that pre-existing local antipathy toward China and the Chinese diaspora provided that connecting tissue. Throughout the colonial era of Southeast Asia, European powers had actually utilized anti-Chinese prejudice to deflect indigenous resentment away from themselves. They branded the Chinese populations inside their colonies as menacing foreigners, even though many actually had long settled in the region, several hundred years for many of these communities. They had been creolized, they had intermarried in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaya, and the Philippines. Now, for the Europeans and the Americans, Western Europeans and Americans, anti-Chinese prejudice had a long history, and I'm not going to go into that here. But in this picture, what you can see, the brief supremacy of the Japanese empire is really an interlude, very brief interlude, in a much longer history of the Chinese yellow peril, here pictured as that much maligned octopus, all right, threatening white civilization with immigration or threatening Southeast Asia via communist expansion. Crucially, what the Americans, British, as well as most conservative Southeast Asian elites believed was that China, whether it was ruled by the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, or when it was controlled by the communists, would use its diasporic networks to gain influence and seize control of the region. So the Chinese diaspora, by the 1950s, numbered about 10 million. And British and US policymakers often expressed their concern that the Chinese had underlying loyalties to, quote, the mother country. In British and Malaya, for example, they were described as the Chinese problem and imperium in imperio, a state within a state. The Americans were worried about Chinese penetration, that was the phrase that they used, of the region. Now, I've published work on this and argue that the very basis of the domino theory, that notion of regional interconnectedness, was underpinned by an Anglo-American imagination of Chinese hegemony in Southeast Asia via its million-strong diasporic fifth column. So in varying degrees, what you'll find in my book, in this presentation, is that this anti-Chinese prejudice fueled the consolidation of power for Southeast Asia's anti-communist nationalists. Local conservative elites weaponized widespread distrust of their Chinese populations. They used the resentment of ethnic Chinese economic success, even though not all of them were actually that prosperous. And they also used the pervasive belief that ethnic Chinese might serve Beijing's subversive goals. They melded this anti-Chinese sentiment with anti-communism during the Cold War, as well as their nationalist movements, and this became the elite's path to power. Now, the case of British colonialism in Malaya is therefore quite interesting. It's because the ethnic Chinese in Malaya made up nearly 40% of the population. And the Malayan Communist Party, the MCP, was 95% ethnic Chinese. There was also a lot of Sino-Malay antagonism in Malaya because, especially following World War II, the MCP went about on reprisal campaigns against Malays, accusing them of being collaborators with the Japanese. Malaya, the world's single largest producer of rubber and tin, was also Britain's biggest dollar earner and made the US its major customer. So for the British colonial authorities who had returned after World War II, The question was, how would Britain manage the decolonization of Malaya? Because it was a declining power. How would it manage the decolonization of Malaya such that it could extend its imperial presence in the country as well as defeat the MCP? And the answer, I borrow from historian Paul Kramer here, the answer was nation-building colonialism. Reorder the colony, change its conditions. What does this mean? Court, cultivate, and sponsor local West-friendly leaders. Usher them towards the head of the independent regime. Guarantee that these new allies, these local allies, are going to align their country with their former colonial ruler. US policy for independent Philippines was pretty similar. They ushered elites to leadership in the post-colonial Philippines. They made all kinds of treaties for trade to link the country to the American economy, and they maintained massive military bases in the Philippines. A journalist has called this, at the time, dependent independence. And that's nation-building colonialism. So let me tell you a little bit about the story of how this unfolded over the 1940s and 1950s. Now, all the way at the left, that's Malcolm MacDonald, the United Kingdom's Commissioner General for Southeast Asia from the late 40s into the mid-1950s. And what he wanted to do was to push the very large Chinese population of Malaya into an anti-communist position. Basically turn against fellows in their community in the Malayan Communist Party. Root out communist sympathizers. Make sure that the Chinese population of Malaya sided with the British instead of their ethnic community, which dominated the Malayan Communist Party. And so he took to the airwaves, right? Radio Malaya, many of the Malayans actually owned radios. And so he was able to visit households a lot at this time through his broadcasts, through his messages. And the main point of his message was to paint these Malayans, the Malayan Communist Party, as aliens. They have no patriotic love for Malaya. It is therefore patriotic to turn against these Malayans, people who had been asking for an independent Malaya from Britain, turn against them. So he did a lot of this broadcasting to get that message out there, to create this binary between outsiders, the Malayan Communist Party, and insiders, Chinese who turn against their ethnic community inside the Malayan Communist Party. Now, he didn't just do a lot of this rhetorical broadcasting. He also made sure that he got together the people that he called men of goodwill, particularly people in the Chinese community who were prominent. And there we go over to this person. This is Sir Cheng Lock Tan, right? He was knighted. He was a Malayan Chinese, prominent businessman, very popular. And what Malcolm MacDonald did was he drew him into this anti-communist campaign. And the thing about Sir Cheng Lock Tan, he was knighted for his efforts, right, is that he was English-speaking, did not speak Chinese at all. As a capitalist, an out-and-out capitalist, he understood that he wouldn't really have a future in a communist-dominated Malaya. And so he joined up as well, seeing that the way that he could have his political legacy burnished and enshrined in Malaya's history was to join up with the British as well. Now, what he did was he created the Malayan Chinese Association. And the philosophy behind behind his being part of this was to say that the Chinese thief is the best person, the Chinese policeman, is the best person to catch the Chinese thief. A Chinese soldier is the best person to pursue, right, the Chinese in the Malayan Communist Party. So that's what he did, contributed to this as well. Tunku Abdul Rahman, I mentioned him earlier, the Prime Minister of Independent Malaya. He led the United Malays National Organization, UMNO, United Malays National Organization. And why he is important here is that he went into a bargain, an alliance with the Malayan Chinese Association. So you have an alliance of two parties, an ethnically pure Chinese party, an ethnically pure Malay party. That alliance allowed both communities to not go for a multiracial political party, while at the same time, ironically, promoting multiracial unity and asking for a multiracial coalition against the 95% Malayan Communist Party. This was actually very successful. It is something that, I guess, was unexpected because of the amount of Sino-Malay antagonism immediately after World War II. To have an alliance of these two parties to push for interracial unity while themselves not necessarily practicing it, and making sure that independent Malaya would be rid of its Malayan Communist Party problem. Malaya rose to independence this way. This is what resulted. It's a Malayan Communist Party guerrilla fighter. He's bloodied by the efforts and everything as more Malays and more Chinese joined in the British anti-MCP efforts. It was essentially an extermination campaign. More guerrillas were killed by the British Malayan effort than even started the revolt in the first place in 1948. The Americans who visited Malaya in the early 1950s, including this person, John Melby, US diplomat, were very impressed by British tenacity and decolonization strategies, especially since other European powers were really fading fast in Southeast Asia. So the Americans watched very closely the success of Malayan nation-building colonialism and counterinsurgency against the MCP. And US diplomat John Melby, when he met Malcolm McDonald, brought back to the US a tract that was written by Sir Cheng Lok Tan as well, in which he obviously talked about how the Chinese man is the best person to defeat the Chinese inside the Malayan Communist Party. Thinking back to how British methods seemed to be working in the 1950s, he penned this in his report to the State Department. It is time we learn the trick of at least having Asians fight Asian battles where yellow men will be killed by yellow men rather than by white men alone. Now, it seems almost superfluous to try explaining what this quote is all about, but Melby's observation captures the heart of British neocolonialism in Malaya, getting local allies to work with the British in that anti-communist struggle, which allowed British power to persist. Outside of Malaya, it was the same. In fact, this violent act by the Royal Marine Commando, cutting off the heads of Malayan Communist Party fighters and sort of taking pictures of it, this violent act was preceded by acts, and also it was parallel to acts all over Southeast Asia. Anti-Chinese policies were actually standard fare for Southeast Asian leaders in all the various countries. So let me show you this guy, right? Pibun Songgram of Thailand. As he was crafting a Thai national identity from the 1930s, he drew on a notorious tract written by the king, King Vajiravut, which called the Chinese the Jews of the East, right? Obviously prejudiced against them, thinking about how to eliminate them from society. He drew on this to whip up anti-Chinese sentiment. He deported Chinese activists who were alleged or known to be connected to the Kuomintang in China. He conducted what was called a Thaification program to eject ethnic Chinese from various sectors of the economy. Did that again in the late 1940s. And he continued in the early Cold War when he came back to power in 1947. And importantly, because he was anti-China, because he was anti-Chinese diaspora, he wanted to maintain his position by becoming a client of the United States. This would have Thailand abandon its traditional neutrality and move into the US orbit, become flush with American military and economic aid, and entrench the Thai military elite in power for decades. Ramon Magsaysay of the Philippines and his predecessors in the Philippines also turned ethnic Chinese out of crucial economic sectors. It's very much like the Thaification program that I've just described. And he did so well into the 50s, using a mix of economic nationalism, anti-Chinese prejudice, and anti-communism to cement a hold on power. This also was part of securing US aid for these efforts. Sukarno of Indonesia, this guy, as a left-leaning leader of Indonesia, was also part of this as well. And in fact, Indonesian history is littered with examples of anti-Chinese pogroms, substantially more brutal, actually, than that in Thailand and the Philippines. But put simply, it was an us versus them mentality, which fired the Indonesian insiders' sense of common suffering and destiny, and trying to mete out justice against easy scapegoats. So indigenous nationalists in Indonesia targeted the Chinese from as early as the 1910s. They called them greedy, exploitative capitalists. They thought of them as infidels, aliens, collaborators with the Dutch. And Chinese businessmen, for example, were attacked in the 1930s. Under Sukarno, there was a restriction of Chinese economic activities in the 1950s, and some 100,000 ethnic Chinese fled the country for fear of persecution. And this is 1950s. And I would say that this is a kissing cousin, really, to Malaya during the emergency, deporting about 40,000 ethnic Chinese to the People's Republic. So what about this little red dot here, if you can barely see, Singapore? Like Malaya, it's also a curious story. It's a Chinese majority here. About 75% to 78% of them are ethnic Chinese. Now, the leader of the People's Action Party, you may know this guy, Lee Kuan Yew, he went on a momentous campaign, also on the airwaves, in 1961. He clogged the airwaves in English, Mandarin, as well as Malay, to denounce his former left-wing allies, the Chinese-speaking trade unionists, and he called them communists and subversive threats to Singapore. This was anti-communist and anti-Chinese at the same time. And some choice quotes of these speeches are, "You know the communists by the fact that he speaks Chinese. You know that he studied in certain schools," meaning the Chinese vernacular schools, "and joined Chinese cultural associations. It was the wrong-headedness of the Chinese educated world that led them towards communism. Nearly all the communists in Malaya are Chinese educated." And these are the kinds of things that he was saying on the radio in the major languages of the country. Now, did it work? Well, he combined it with the use of the repressive tools of British policy, which was to incarcerate all the suspected communists as well and decapitate, basically, the left-wing movement in the country. So using anti-Chinese prejudice, though himself ethnic Chinese, but targeting specifically Chinese-speaking, Chinese cultural organizations, trade unions that are dominated by Chinese-speaking Singaporeans, and so on. Okay, so what about Sukarno? Because as I mentioned earlier, he's left-leaning, he's also anti-Chinese. What does this have to do with the story? Now, here I'm going to say that the role of British neocolonialism was especially crucial, but I need to go on a very brief detour to view the long shadow that Britain cast over the US. Now, this is an article from the Reader's Digest in 1962, and this is by William Lederer. You may know him as one of the co-authors of The Ugly American with Eugene Burdick. And the title of it is "The Guerrilla War That the Reds Lost." One of the opening sentences is, "In communist-threatened Southeast Asia, there shines one bright spot. It is the happy land of Malaya." And here he talks with great enthusiasm and fascination about British counterinsurgency. He celebrates it and is obsessed about learning from it. What was British counterinsurgency that he was so fascinated by? It was corralling Chinese Malayans into camps that they called new villages, right? Corralling them into camps to hive them off from the Malayan Communist Party guerrillas. This article called these camps, the new villages, the wonders of the war. And the magic of these camps, I guess you would say, was that it was no longer possible for the MCP guerrillas to dictate when they would strike and how they would get supplies from the ethnic Chinese of Malaya. Now it was possible for the British to trace MCP guerrillas to their hideouts as they tried to get supplies, as they tried to get recruits from these new villages that were very much more easily policed by British officers as well as their Malayan allies. So that's why there was a lot of fascination with it. I'll say even more. The preoccupation went all the way into military planners as well as politicians. This is the US Army Handbook from December 1960. It's the Handbook for Suppression of Communist Guerrillas and Terrorist Operations, and the picture kind of tells you what its goals are, right? This handbook was produced in December 1960, a few months after the end of the emergency in Malaya. And what it said was really the British in Malaya were the only successful example other than the American campaign against the Hak Balahap peasant rebellion in the Philippines. And these were two big examples that the US could learn from if it was going to adopt an effective counterinsurgency campaign for the future. Now, it is said that President John Kennedy, shortly after his inauguration, turned to his advisors and said, "What are we going to do about guerrilla warfare?" And soon, his administration was inundated with studies such as this one. This one was recommended to him by Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy, accompanied it with a note saying, "This is a fantastic study. I wish there were more of them. We need to do more of these types of studies to learn from the right examples. The US Army used the British counterinsurgency manual, ATOM, Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya, used it and parceled it out to all its units for doctrine formulation, such that by the early 1960s, almost every one of the army units was developing its counterinsurgency doctrine based on ATOM, the British manual. By 1961, the US Army had almost 70 nations as clients of an American counterinsurgency training doctrine, which drew heavily on the British model. This number would continue to grow throughout the Cold War. The Americans called this their transmission belt. And I think that in many of their documents, there's an undisguised glee about the fact that many nations wanted to sign up for this counterinsurgency training program. And every year into the late 60s, US policymakers demanded more and more studies of counterinsurgency practices, and they kept going back to the British example. It wouldn't stop. In 1962, RAND Corporation, the think tank commissioned by the State Department, did a study, multiple studies about intelligence, food control, population control, using helicopters, and so on. This was completed in 1964. It's about 600 pages. It's longer than my dissertation, right? And it comes out in September 1964, the month after President Johnson acquired the fateful Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave him power to wage war in Vietnam. It seeped onto the silver screens as well. This is a movie from United Artists, 1964. It's based on an Australian novel, The Durian Tree. I guess The Durian Tree wouldn't make very much of a good movie title. It's called The Seventh Dawn. You look very carefully, it's William Holden, slightly past his prime, and it's filmed in Malaysia. And what is this story about? Well, The Durian Tree is about an Australian counterinsurgency expert who stays in Malaya and teaches the British how to defeat the Malayan Communist Party. In the movie, obviously, that Australian is replaced by William Holden. It's an American counterinsurgency expert. Now, what is this movie really about? Well, I watched it so you didn't have to. I think the main point behind this is the fantasy that it was possible to appropriate British skills, British tactics, and British doctrine, and think about the possibility of exporting it northward into Vietnam. That it gets all the way onto the silver screens is not just in Reader's Digest, but also in planning documents, suggests a lot about that long shadow that Britain cast over the US. And that's why, even though Washington officials were worried about the Chinese population of Singapore, they were very much apprised of what Lee Kuan Yew's struggle was in Singapore against the left-wing Chinese. JFK and his close advisors seemed to expect that the creation of Malaysia, by absorbing Singapore into anti-communist Malaya, that would snuff out what one US official called the Singapore Reds, Singapore communists. So the creation of Malaysia, absorbing Singapore into anti-communist Malaya, would see Malaya's anti-communist methods and its internal security tools snuff out Singapore's communists. That's why Kennedy said this 12 days after Singapore's left-wing activists were incarcerated. 12 days after. Malaysia, the creation of Malaysia, is the best hope for security in that very, very vital region. And furthermore, it was during the Kennedy administration, as I've mentioned to you earlier, that Kennedy's advisors envisioned Malaysia creating that wide anti-communist arc that enclosed the South China Sea. And so here's where we come back to Sukarno, right? He enacted anti-Chinese policies, but he was, ideologically speaking, pro-Beijing in the Sino-Soviet rivalry for primacy in the communist world. And his power base very much depended on the massive political heft of the Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI. This was the third largest communist party in the world. While he himself was not necessarily communist, he depended a great deal on the social grassroots networks of the PKI. Now, how is this connected to British neocolonialism? How is this connected to anti-communist Southeast Asian nationalism and US hegemony? Well, in 1963, Sukarno officially launched Konfrontasi, or confrontation. And what was this about? It was about crushing Malaysia, which was due to be created in September 1963. He, Sukarno, opposed the creation of Malaysia because he called it a British neo-colonial plot to encircle Indonesia. He called the Tengku a colonial stooge. He also believed that the military bases that the British maintained in Singapore would be used against him. Now, even the New York Times called Malaysia a giant and mentioned that it might be a counterweight to Indonesian aggression from the south. The aggression also came actually from Singapore and Malaysia against Indonesia with British help. Lee Kuan Yew, you see him pictured here at his very exuberant best. Lee Kuan Yew was already on the move in 1962, expecting that the Indonesians would have a problem with the creation of Malaysia. Where did he go? He went to the non-aligned world to turn them against Sukarno. In 1962, he visited Yugoslavia, Burma, India, and Egypt to plead the case of creating Malaysia, and he won these former friends of Sukarno over. Egypt and India were very friendly to the creation of Malaysia. Yugoslavia apologized for having criticized Malaysia before. Burma agreed that the Federation of Malaysia allowed small states like Singapore to actually succeed. But at the same time that Indonesia was launching confrontasi, British and Malaysian troops were raiding Indonesian Borneo to keep Indonesian forces on the back foot. And Malaya funneled support to Indonesian secessionists to destabilize the country, waging confrontasi for Sukarno when he had a declining economy, sent the country in many ways into free fall. Crucially, Indonesian diplomats could not match what Lee Kuan Yew and his team from Sarawak and Sabah, British Borneo, did in early 1964. They went on a goodwill tour of 17 African nations to convince African leaders that Sukarno's aggression was unwarranted and that Malaysia was the legitimate fulfillment of local self-determination aspirations. And he often found himself on the roll. Many agreed with him. He actually struck a vein of distaste for Sukarno. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Ethiopia's Haile Selassie called Sukarno a Hitler. And this is a part that's pretty critical. Ivory Coast and Kenya both agreed to support Malaysia's entry into the rotating membership of the United Nations Security Council by early 1965. And this helped to lock in Malaysia's legitimacy in the world body at the beginning of that year. In fact, by late 1964, in Egypt, the Afro-Asian nations had already begun to condemn Sukarno's anti-Malaysia campaign. Basically, Malaysia had outflanked Sukarno. Sukarno, realizing this, withdrew Indonesia from the United Nations. In his memoirs, he said something that was, I think, very, very appropriately captured what was going on. He said that colonialism wasn't retreating in my backyard, it was just changing shape. And I agree. But there was something else he did not see coming. The pro-US Indonesian army, which had been courted, trained, and equipped by Washington since the late 1950s. This was an anti-communist group in Indonesia. It was distrustful of the Indonesian communists, and it needed only a pretext to seize power from Sukarno. It was, as one historian has called it, a government in waiting. The PKI was rightly worried about the army, but they tripped up trying to seize the initiative. They mounted an operation to sequester Sukarno, protect him from the right-wing army. And this made it almost too easy for the army. Under Major General Suharto, you see him pictured here, the army made their bid for power. Like the Thais, like the Filipinos, like the Malaysians, like the Singaporeans, the utilization of anti-Chinese prejudice came into the picture. The army used anti-Chinese sentiment, mixed it into a deadly cocktail with anti-communism, blamed China for the PKI's move. It suggested that ethnic Chinese were in league with Beijing and that Beijing powered the PKI. Sukarno, in fact, had laid the foundations for this because he himself had condoned the last spate of anti-Chinese violence in May 1963, which was only 2 years before. And he had very recently enacted discriminatory laws against Indonesian Chinese, empowering officials to evict Indonesian Chinese from their homes if they were considered security threats. So he had contributed to this as well. There was a current of it that was almost too easy for Suharto to take advantage of. Some 200,000 ethnic Chinese were coerced into leaving for China, a land that they did not know. And many thousands of Chinese, along with the PKI, which was not majority Chinese, by the way, they were massacred. Figures go anywhere between 500,000 to about 1 million, still not really clear. In 1967, Jakarta, under Suharto, broke diplomatic relations with Beijing, and this was likely the greatest transformation in East and Southeast Asian history in the 1960s. So herein lies a very important irony. Just as the United States committed its combat troops to Americanizing the Vietnam War to prevent the dominoes from falling to communism, most of Southeast Asia had already shifted into the US orbit. And as British influence waned following confrontasi, Singapore followed its northern neighbor, Malaya, and gravitated towards the United States even more explicitly. Lee Kuan Yew became one of the foremost apologists for the US war in Vietnam and allowed for US soldiers to come to Singapore for R&R, bringing a minor spending boom. Now, here's a cartoon that was drawn by left-wing activists in Singapore in 1966. You can see it's Lee Kuan Yew on the right, LBJ on the left. Kind of, they look like they're about to have a kiss, right? And this was drawn in 1966. This was a year before these men had even met, right? And the message is clear, that the soldiers coming from Vietnam with this flag to Singapore for vacation were being facilitated, right, by this US-Singapore relationship, okay? Siding with the United States was a great money spinner for Singapore. Military procurements from Singapore for the Vietnam War totaled about 15% of the Singapore national income. US investment in Singapore flowered, gradually replacing the vacuum that Britain would leave behind as they withdrew from the region. By the late 1960s, therefore, the founding members of ASEAN, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia were firmly to the right of the Cold War ideological divide, and this overall US pro-US trajectory of the region had become clear. More crucially, the revolutions of Indochina was surrounded by a wide anti-communist arc. Now, did the Americans who were stuck in the war in Vietnam, downcast over their faltering efforts, even notice? Well, here are some of the things that I said earlier, and you can put them in context. By August 1967, President Lyndon Johnson announced that the US had on its side a great arc of Asian and Pacific nations. That's the ASEAN states, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. He understood, and he said this in press conferences, that Asian nations were suspicious of China, saw communism as anti-nationalist, and he argued that the reverse domino effect was already in play. And he wasn't the only one that noticed. From 1968 to 1969, the Soviet Union, this is Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, admitted to American officials that American predominance in the Pacific was a fact and a valuable check against their common enemy, China. Brezhnev did attempt to peddle a Soviet-led security system to the ASEAN nations, but it fell flat. He couldn't get very much out of it. In early 1969, Zhou Enlai, at the top right, responsible for the day-to-day operations of Chinese foreign policy, expressed frustration that China was encircled, this was the phrase he used, encircled and isolated on most key policy issues. Zhou, in meeting Henry Kissinger several years later, would say, the forces for containing China in Southeast Asia are more numerous than in any other area of the world. Combined with the destabilizing Cultural Revolution at home and the rivalry with the Soviet Union, China would end up accommodating to de facto US hegemony in Southeast Asia. From the outside of the White House looking in, Richard Nixon in October 1967 also articulated the same sentiments. He wrote in Foreign Affairs this article entitled Asia After Vietnam. And what he did was he encouraged US policymakers to look beyond Vietnam. He said, look beyond Vietnam for opportunities. He said, this small nation, Vietnam, fills our minds, the screen of our minds, but it should not fill the map because all around the rim of China are US allies, Asian nations who see the US as a protector and are concerned with Chinese nationalism and expansionism. He described the long belt of pro-US, pro-Western nations that stretch from Japan through Southeast Asia. He talked about the 3,000-mile arc of Indonesian islands that goes all the way to India, anchored by Australia and New Zealand, stalwart allies of the United States, linked by the sea to America. Basically, the argument was to pivot to the rest of Asia, away from Vietnam, to see what was a more characteristic pattern of the region's path following the Pacific War. And what did they all behold? What did Johnson, Zhou Enlai, Brezhnev, and Nixon, what did they see? Well, they saw this map that's inside my book. This is the US empire of Dominoes. It arced around the South China Sea. It contained the revolutions of Indochina and encircled China. This arc connected ASEAN to US allies Japan and South Korea. And in the early Cold War, Southeast Asian nations had been perceived as interconnected in insecurity, that they had been teetering like dominoes towards communism. But by the end of the Vietnam War, they had drawn closer to the United States. They had become stable regimes, which were dependably pro-US leaders. This condition had been produced by British neocolonialism, the anti-Chinese foundations of anti-communist nationalism in Southeast Asia, and the eagerness with which the United States sought to consolidate the advantage, building deeper military and economic relations with its friends in the region. So the ASEAN states had not cast off the colonial order. Instead, what they did was establish a new imperial system in collaboration with the United States to preserve or voluntarily circumscribe their existing or newfound independence. And they did so during the Cold War, which I think of as really a bloody chapter in a much longer and continuous history of Western imperialism in Southeast Asia. The Cold War, a transitional phase between European-dominated colonialism and US hegemony. And that's why it's the arc of containment. Thanks very much. I'll take questions.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of the Dilemma. Please check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.